Hello,
Hoş geldiniz.
I'm Dr. Işılay Gürsu,
I'm Dr. Peter Cherry.
and welcome to the Heritage Türkiye podcast by the British Institute at Ankara, BIAA.
And today we have a guest calling to us directly from the UK. Today we're joined by Dr. Natalie Martin. Who's Assistant Professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham.
In December, Natalie rotated off the BIAA Council and now serves on the BIAA's Development Committee. She's a specialist in Turkish and EU politics, Turkish foreign policy, and researches issues around media freedom, disinformation, and democracy.
And she's author of the monograph, The Securitisation of News in Turkey, Journalists as Terrorists, which was published in 2020. And prior to academia, she was a journalist working in local and national outlets. So first of all, thank you very much for joining us, Natalie.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So Natalie, what first brought you to working on Turkey?
Oh, this goes back a long, long way. When I first graduated, my first degree was philosophy, absolutely nothing to do with Turkey. But in one of my summer holidays, I taught English as a foreign language on the south coast in the UK. I mean, this is going back to the late 1980s. And a lot of my students were Turkish. And obviously they said, you must come to my country. My country is beautiful. So the next year, when I graduated, I applied for a job teaching English as a foreign language in Turkey. And I didn't know much about Turkey at that time. And I ended up in Diyarbakir teaching English to engineers on the Ataturk Dam, which shows you how long ago it was. Which was an experience. I thought I was going to Istanbul, basically, and obviously ended up somewhere completely different, but completely fell in love with the politics and the whole country. Got very interested in the politics. When I came back to the UK, I did an MA at SOAS in modern Turkish studies. So that's the beginning of my journey, and obviously it's come quite a long way since. In between that time, I started a career as a journalist, but I always maintained that academic interest in Turkey. And then, fast forward another 15 years or so, and I did a PhD in the Turkey-EU accession process. And now is now.
So that brings us on to the next question then. So when it comes to, moving from journalism to academia, what do you think are the fundamental differences between a journalistic approach and an academic approach?
Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot of similarities between the journalistic approach and the academic approach. It's all about gathering data, but it's how you process it, which is where the difference lies. So journalism is very much a quick turnaround. You gather the data, you put it on air. With academia, you gather the data and then you spend 2 years thinking about it before you turn it into some kind of academic output. So it could be the same information, but it's much, much more processed. Obviously, it goes through peer review process as well. Yeah. So but the main difference probably is the application of theory. Yeah, so it's not just about descriptive raw data. Academia is also about applying theories to that raw data.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, a lot of my sources are media sources. I'll give you an example. I covered the 2004, when Turkey was accepted as a candidate in December 2004 in Brussels. So I was in Istanbul, and I had I arranged all that. I studio produced it. And then, I wrote a PhD on it. So I'm using the same raw material, but it's just packaging it up in a very different way. And they have different purposes. So journalism is the first version of history. And, what I do, international relations, which is basically history, with a bit of politics thrown in, is about the fifth or sixth version. And when it's been pondered upon by all sorts of people to check that it's right. So it's not the first version, it's the nth version. But it's the same material, but it enables you to go into much, much more depth, which is more satisfying as a researcher, but not as adrenaline fuels.
I'm imagining that you are never suffering from writer's block.
No, actually, that isn't something I suffer from because I spent a lot of time having to write and it became second nature to me. So I'm lucky. That is not something I'm afflicted with. Procrastination, possibly,
Yeah.
which is a different thing. Yeah. But no, not writer's block.
And so, an area that you've also been working on is Turkey and EU relations. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that, about your work in that area?
Yeah, my PhD was basically a history of Turkey-EU relations, 99 to 2004. And then I wrote another monograph based on the PhD where I brought that up to probably about 2013. It was prior to the big AKP-Gulen split. That was a point where it stopped. Because it was published in 2050. So Turkey-EU relations, 99 to 2004, was all about the British government, yeah, and the role of the Labour government within the EU to bring forward the Turkish case, because at that point the UK within the EU was basically working. I wouldn't want to state this too strongly, but they were doing what the US wanted because UK and US interests tended to coincide, and both saw it as a good thing that Turkey was encouraged to democratize. What they meant by that was liberalize, but what they used to say was democratize. So the UK worked quite closely with Washington in order to bring Turkey on enough, working with the AKP government, that Brussels would accept candidacy in 2004. And my initial PhD documented how that worked. So they, for example, they encouraged the AKP government. So Jack Straw, who was the foreign secretary at that time, worked quite closely with Abdullah Gül on this. They would encourage the Turkish government to bring forward reforms that would sit well in Brussels. So women's rights, Kurdish rights, etc. So they did the headline. They made enough headlines that Brussels said, okay, you don't meet the Copenhagen criteria enough, but you have made enough progress that we will open negotiations in October 2005, which is what they did. Obviously, that's when it stopped. Yeah. So my initial research then looked at the reasons why progress stopped as well. And that was because the AKP lost heart in the EU's sincerity of its intentions. And that was because a lot of the personnel changed in Brussels at that time. So you had changes of leadership in France and Germany. So Chirac went, and Angela Merkel came in, and everything changed. And so the Turks realized that they were not going to make any more progress within the EU. Austria, Cyprus, and a couple of others would always block any progress. And that's when things changed, I think, domestically in Turkish domestic politics around 2007. And you start on the path where we see the end of now. So the EU was a major force for change, but that stopped when the Turks stopped believing in the sincerity of the intent, which was about 2006, 2007.
Yeah.
And so that's what my first book was about. And then after that, I stopped focusing purely on Turkey-EU relationship, partly because nothing was happening, but started looking at, the sort of de-democratization processes within Turkey, drawing on my own previous experience in journalism, because I understand that world, and applying it to the bigger picture. It was also partly, my change happened partly because, when I first started researching Turkey, I would go to Ankara and I would be able to go between the ministries and people would invite me in, give me tea, tell me anything I wanted to know. But, as time went on, especially after 2013, that wasn't possible anymore. And so I needed to change slightly how I collected data, and that had implications for the questions I was asking. So I could no longer just go and talk to people quite as freely as I had done, partly because I may be putting them at risk and there was an ethical concern.
Yes.
Partly because they probably couldn't tell me anything I didn't already know anyway, because there was more of a party line, literally, to be towed. So I started looking at research which I could do with data which was available to me in a different way. So, media sources, for example. So that was a long answer to
No,
the
no, no.
question. I hope.
Great
It's
answer.
very interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Coming from EU to the UK,
Yes.
how do you think that Brexit has affected the UK and Turkey relationships?
Yeah. Don't get me started on how it's affected the UK, because I might never stop. I think Brexit was a bad thing, for reasons which I'm sure you can understand. The implications for Turkey are that it lost its advocate, one of its main advocates within the European Union.
Mm.
So you no longer have, the equivalent of Jack Straw making the case in Brussels. And the Americans also lost, their proxy within the EU. I'm sure they replaced them with others, but it's not the same relationship. So that is more difficult for Turkey. And I think it probably, this isn't something I've done research on, but off the top of my head, it has probably contributed to de-democratization processes within Turkey, because there's more reasons why it won't make any progress within the EU if it's lost that advocacy. There are obviously a lot of other reasons as well. Turkey does not meet the Copenhagen criteria, and it's never going to be, but it lost the incentive. This was also replaced by the incentive of the migration deals. So Turkey's become much, much more transactional, the relationship between Turkey and the EU. And it's all about migration deals, I think, at the moment. Whenever things go quiet in Brussels, Erdogan sort of makes a speech saying, we can stop cooperating on migration. And then Brussels comes back to the table and, everything shuffles on for another couple of years. And that's how it's been for a long time now. And what you don't have is that critical friend that was the role the UK used to play and act as a mediator between Ankara and Brussels, and that's gone, which is a shame. And there will be implications for European security more generally, because it's not just the EU, it's also NATO and various other places. But it's just made things more difficult, I think, and it's been detrimental, but for all parties concerned, the UK, Turkey, and the EU as well.
Yeah. Well, it's also, it strikes me as well that the EU is obviously well, there's lots of drives to enlarging it, to include obviously Moldova, Ukraine in this direction. And I wonder how that's actually received sort of politically in Turkey, if, the EU is sort of enlarging on the kind of eastern side in that direction, how that would be received in Turkey.
I can't talk to the more recent enlargement rounds, but I can talk about the sort of 2004 enlargement round,
Yeah,
when
please, actually.
it was one of the factors which drove forward the case for candidacy between 1999 and 2004, was the fact that you had the Sikhs, so the Central and Eastern European countries, such as Romania and Bulgaria. They were a little bit later, they were 2007, but Erdogan often made this case, if you're letting them in, why aren't you talking to us? And he was probably right about that, actually. Yeah. And if you look at the case of Hungary, it was probably definitely right. It's just that after 2007, Turkey has deteriorated further. But between, from 2002 to 2004, there are reasonable grounds to presume that the AKP had some intention to keep making enough reforms towards the Copenhagen criteria, and yet it was always treated differently from European countries, the former Warsaw Pact countries, and definitely Ankara really felt that they were being othered at that point, and they had to meet higher criteria than the Balkan countries, and that didn't really go down well. I think that was definitely one of the ways in which the Brits behind the scenes were making the case for Turkey. I think if you fast forward to the contemporary situation, things have changed a lot. I think Ukraine is a case on its own. That's obviously hugely complicated. I think really Turkey now has gone so far away. It's moved further and further away from the Copenhagen criteria. I'm not sure its case is as strong anymore as it was 20 something years ago. It would be more difficult now, I think, for Erdogan to make that case. I'm not even sure he would try.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'd have
Can
to
I?
think more about.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Can I also just building up on the sort of the Brexit question as well? Could you talk a little bit about the UK's relationship with and of course Turkey's relationship with the UK a bit more as well? Would you see it as a generally kind of constructive, positive relationship? What's your reading?
Yeah, it depends on which government you're talking about, I think. So the Labour government, so up to 2010, or certainly during the Tony Blair years, it was quite close. I mean, Jack Straw and Abdullah Gül, were probably friends. They used to go on holiday and things like that.
Oh, right, I didn't know
They
that.
had quite a close personal relationship.
Mm.
And there was a lot of acknowledgement, I think, at that time that the Brits had really played a key role in getting Turkey the candidacy. It started to falter a little bit after 2005 when they weren't able to maintain that momentum because of Austria, Cyprus, and a few others. But yeah, there was certainly, they had laid a good groundwork. And the relationship after the end of the Labour government, so from 2010, was more a sort of a matter of containment because nothing really happened in terms of EU accession. My understanding was that it was much, much more about trade deals at that time. And so the first of all, you had the coalition government and then the Conservative government. You'd have ministers fly in, usually to the consulate rather than the embassy in Ankara. So the consulate in Istanbul, which was much more about trade. And from the research I was doing at that time, people used to say, yes, we mention human rights at the end of these meetings, but we don't really want to upset anybody because what we're really interested in is the trade deal. So it was very much about containing the Turks, and it was much more about the bilateral relationship rather than the Turkey EU European security relationship, because this is pre-2014. So the security relationship wasn't as crucial at that time. It's become so since, but then you get into the whole realms of the Boris Johnson era, which is different again.
Yeah. Can I change the topic a little bit
Sure.
and ask about the fake news, because you also have done research about fake news. So can you tell us a little bit about how trends in misinformation are experienced in Turkey, and how worried should we be about the spread of fake news?
Yeah, so my research on disinformation and misinformation has really stemmed from my observations of the Turkish situation. So it's partly since my book on the securitization of news. Yeah. So what I asked was, how is the AKP government and Erdogan in particular so effective? Because it's all about the discourse and the narratives, and he uses them very, very well. Yeah, which is why he's still in power. More than 20 years later. Very, very effective talker, very effective speaker. But what they do and what they have done, in this de-democratization process, is get to the point where they control the conduits of news. Yeah. And they can then use those conduits, so those news outlets, to target through news the political opposition. And this is very much based on the book. So you have this conduit and target framework, which is done through the dissemination of disinformation as news. Yeah. So you can destroy the reputation. So, for example, I'm trying to take a fairly neutral example. Neutral is the wrong word, but as neutral as it gets in Turkey. So if you take the case of Ahmed Şık, yeah, he has been denigrated as deep state Kemalist and Gulenist and and Kurdish associate at different times, even though those things are contradictory. But it's always a way of targeting his journalism and delegitimizing his journalism. And that's how the AKP has operated. And Erdogan is, extremely, extremely effective at controlling enough of the outlets such that news can be disinformation. So this needs a clarification of what we mean. I wouldn't use the term fake news. Donald Trump has really discredited that term by ironically turning it on itself. But I instead use the three-pronged definition of disordered information of Wardle and Derrickson. Yeah, so you have disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. Yeah. So disinformation is false and intended to be malicious. Misinformation is false, but is inadvertently used. So if someone's sharing a Facebook page, not realizing that it's false, yeah. And then malinformation, and possibly the most interesting type, is true information which is spread maliciously. You can see all three types in Turkish political discourse. Yeah. So you have the false stuff, the false stuff which is then spread by people who don't realize it's false, and then you have the true stuff, the compromat, which is spread, which also is discrediting reputations. That's malinformation. But then, if you take, there's numerous examples. So if you look at Ergenekon, yeah, you have a lot of what I presume to be disinformation about the Turkish military, possibly with an element of truth in it. Yeah. If you come later, you have a lot of disinformation about Gülen movements. But the where it becomes really complicated is obviously when Gülen was in alliance with the AKP, they were both producing disinformation. So you have this whole framework, which I witnessed in Turkey and wrote about in both my books and a couple of other articles as well, which I then realized doesn't just apply in Turkey, it applies in a lot of places, including the UK. So this may be a lower level of a higher level of liberality, but it's still there. So even in the UK, you have controlled news outlets and you have people who are targeted using news, which is actually disinformation or malinformation. But again, it gets a little bit complicated because you could argue that malinformation is just journalism, yeah, if it's true. But so the real problematic stuff is the disinformation. And it's problematic because it can become misinformation. Yeah.
Right.
And again, we're talking in Turkey mainly about the mainstream outlets, but increasingly you also have to take into account social media, which is where the younger generation tend to get their news from. And in that scenario, there's very few gatekeepers. So anyone can publish on social media. You don't have any kind of verification. So if anyone can publish, that means that it becomes, a complete Wild West in terms of information sources. So in the Turkish case, this is slightly different from the UK case. So if I concentrate on the Turkish case, I think off the top of my head, I think most people still get their news from the mainstream news outlets, and because they are so controlled by either directly by government or by government proxies, the information space is very much it is a political weapon, and so that can be used to further the case of the incumbent government, of the AKP government, but it can also be used to target political actors. And we see that in the current situation with İmamoğlu, I think, as well, as it has played out over the last couple of months.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned briefly about social media. So you're also working on new forms of journalism, or so it says on your university website. What exactly are these new forms of journalism that you're referring to? Exactly.
I work quite a lot with the Bellingcat organization. Yeah, that may be a bit misleading. I mean, I certainly hadn't done that in the Turkish case, so you probably don't want to.
No, please go ahead. I mean, please talk about generally, what because I mean, one thing I can say is I've noticed in Turkey recently, there's a move to blue sky, but there's also I've started to see a lot of people using Substack and things like this. I wondered, I mean, is that also in the UK? Are those also kind of areas of journalism you're looking at as well?
Yes, yeah. So this is not in the Turkish case specifically, but generally speaking, those new forms. So you could call it citizen journalism, although that term is contested. Yeah,
Right.
Or emerge where it's not possible to have verified, where you have a high level of government control over the mainstream sources. So I haven't researched this in the Turkish case, and there are other people who have, but I would imagine that it's safe in Turkey to have an anonymous Substack or even a named Substack, but it's not so safe to publish the same stuff it's not possible to publish the same stuff through mainstream outlets. So you could have a Substack based outside of Turkey, which it's less easy to control. The problem arises in the audience for those new forms of journalism. So you would need to have a mass audience for it to have an effect. Otherwise, it can become so niche that it can be easily dismissed as, elite, liberal. Turkey isn't the only place where we see this sort of narrative about these new forms. But I still think they're important. In the UK context, you have got quite a few new players into the market, and you also have a big splurge of Substacks and podcasts, which make a real contribution towards the information space.
Yes, definitely.
However, in the UK case, and this is where my research has been more recently, this also means that they're not always verified. So not so much Substacks and podcasts, but certainly X and even Blue Sky accounts. You can publish straight. No, there is no gatekeeper involved. So that also has risks, because that can be weaponized and become a political tool in its own right. So it's a good thing, but you need then the consumers of that information to be able to do their own verification. Otherwise, it can become a bad thing. And that's the problem. How do you put that into operation? Perhaps the US case would be the most easiest to understand because it's more extreme than the UK case, and it doesn't really apply yet to the Turkish case, possibly. But certainly, I think you can see in the US that there are many, many inputs into the information space, and not all of them are reliable. But a lot of people think they're reliable. So in the dismiss and malinformation jargon, you have a lot of disinformation being spread as misinformation, and it's very hard for your average person to tell the difference, to know whether it's true or false. So what I would argue, and I've done some work with the Bellingcat organization on this, is we need to introduce skills. So if anyone can publish, then anyone should be able to verify. So they basically need some of those Bellingcat skills of open source investigation, or at least some critical thinking skills to question where the source is coming from. And that's what we don't have, because people are still in the habit of relying on journalists to do the verification for them, even though journalists are no longer the source of all their information. So we're in a sort of a transition stage. So it could go one way or the other. So if you're not careful, if you have a completely unregulated information space, you can end up with several different realities. Which is what's happened in the States, possibly. So we need to make sure that doesn't happen, certainly in the UK. I think Turkey is a different case for various reasons, because its political situation is different. And it has more reliance on mainstream media still.
Thank you.
But these are basically issues that a lot of democracies face, and it could undermine democracy ultimately, because democracy rests on information and being able to trust information.
Absolutely.
So this brings us to our last question that we usually ask to our guests, because your time on the BIAA Council came to an end. So we would like to ask you, what are your hopes for the BIA's future? What kind of a future do you envisage?
I think the BIA performs a really important function in it's just maintaining a forum for discussion about the relationship between the UK and Turkey, which is a really important relationship and a really interesting relationship. And a lot of Brits actually have an interest in Turkey because they go on holiday there. So they're much, it's easier to make a case for the UK-Turkey relationship than, I don't know, somewhere in Africa where people don't go on holiday. Yeah. So they have some understanding of the situation, but it's really important that there is a forum going forward for a considered understanding, and the BIA has performed that role. The last few years have been difficult because there was COVID in the middle of it all, which stopped a lot of things happening, and obviously now we have financial constraints. But I think it's really important that it continues in some form, and this is why the podcast is also so important, because this is one way of getting message out there, isn't it? And podcasting is the future, certainly at the moment.
So,
and it's a great way. I mean, I'm a great podcast fan myself.
So I was going to say the BIA is at the forefront of new forms of journalism, and we can claim that. Well, let's claim that. So yeah.
I hope so. I would. I can't resist jumping in to make the distinction between news and journalism. Yeah. But I won't bore you or your listeners with that. But it's quite important. So news is just information, whereas journalism is the kind of challenging information.
Yeah.
Which is perhaps difficult to do in a Turkish context sometimes. But I think it's important just to bear it in mind. But yes, anything which creates a forum for a considered view of the relationship is important. It really is, because Turkey plays such an important part in the whole of European security. Yeah? And also Turkey deserves to have a considered view of its politics. It's very nuanced. It's not simple. And that's the function that the BIA can perform going forward, I think.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Natalie, for your time.
Thank you.
And
you're welcome.
And please, long may you be involved in the BIA. Please continue. So,
okay.
So teşekkürler, thank you, and to those watching or listening, görüşürüz.
Görüşürüz. Thank you.